Hi guys, welcome back. So we have Jim.
Hey buddy.
Jim has joined us as a historical editor. This is Monday marks the end of the 5-part Tet Offensive article series, which has been looking at gaming in Vietnam. A phenomenal series, and loads and loads of comments and stuff on that. So this was our chance to get a catch up with Jim, just to get a quick overview of what has taken place and some of what to expect come Monday. Jim, welcome back on the show, mate. Always good to have you.
Thanks very much. Always glad to be here.
So the article series started on January 22nd. It's been every Monday since then. Right. Loads of community engagement. People are just chewing and getting stuck in on this one.
We've definitely had a great community response on this one. We started off, like you said, on the 22nd of January. We were aiming at the last week of January, kind of on purpose in order to hit that January 30th and 31st 50th anniversary. Yeah. 50th anniversaries are the ones you really want to hit. I mean, it's always great to do like the 879th anniversary or something, but the 50s, the 75s, the 100s, you really only get one chance to do those.
Yeah. Now we want to do a quick shout out to some of the guys, some of the people that helped with that. So I believe the big props go to Dave Wheeler for this.
Absolutely, Dave Wheeler was huge on this. That's Dave PPG on the site. He helped me a lot with some of the photos that he sent in. Vietnam is one of those conflicts. If you're going to do some sort of gaming in Vietnam, no matter what scale, that you're really going to need a Vietnam-specific army. I mean, you don't usually get Hueys with your, Eastern Front Germans or your Napoleonics or anything like that. So it's kind of tough to do. Sometimes it's tough to break into that particular conflict because you have to go out and you have to buy a bunch of armies or whatever to kind of get started on that. And guys like Dave Wheeler really helped out because they have large Vietnam armies already set up, especially his Riverine force, his mobile Riverine force. That's a brigade of the 9th Infantry Division that help out with a lot of the river battles that you see in the southern part of South Vietnam.
Yeah. That's actually one thing I've actually started to notice with historical gamers is once they actually start exploring different areas of history, there's always that one that just hooks their attention, and the stories from that period are just exactly where they want to play and where they want to explore. Yeah. It's
very, very collectible, the historical gaming side of things as well. It's I've got to say it is absolutely one that when you get hooked, you totally get hooked. And I am now totally hooked, and I have the evidence for this, Jim. I have the evidence. I have now been inducted into the Historical Grognard Gaming Society.
Well, I did.
Yes, you have.
Check this out. Look at that.
There it is.
So I now have a seat at the table. I have my own cognac and cigar, and I can sit and chew the fat, and because everything I say is historically accurate. Isn't that right, Jim?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you see, here's the thing. It reads on the bottom. On this 11th of February 2018, henceforth and in perpetuity, a member in good standing. That means you can do no wrong now. You can do no wrong.
I can now hold my own with all the other grognards and just sit and chillax and just let all of this historical goodness just wash over me.
You do realize that this that as a newer member, you're at the silver level. Then there's gold and platinum. Right now you've got the cognac and the cigar. If you when you get up to the platinum level, you've got the Southern Comfort and the pipe.
It's like the Illuminati. There are levels.
Yes, this is great. It gives me opportunities to grow. It gives me opportunities to grow. It is fascinating though. It's for many of you in gaming, you will come to a point because what kind of spurred this particular conversation on about this was we had a community member recently talking about how they had kind of mixed feelings, and a lot of people do when they were doing their gaming, that sometimes they can feel a bit childish or whatever, with this being your hobby. And I said, never feel childish. It doesn't matter what you play, do it, because we have a saying here: you'll be a long time dead. So just enjoy your life and enjoy your hobby as as a fundamental and an inspiring part of your life. However, if you want to try and get into something a bit more meaty in the hobby, I have found the historical side of the hobby to just totally open up so many interesting avenues, and and it allows you to sit and talk to people, because you'd be surprised how many people that aren't into gaming are totally into history and the history of conflict and stuff like that. And it has been fascinating. I've loved my journey through the stuff in World War II, this stuff with Jim in Vietnam. My own personal preference, just at this moment in time, is I'm really loving the Dark Ages stuff with the Vikings, Saxons, Normans, and the likes. Well, I find it an interesting.
There's a lot of real estate there to cover.
Yeah.
The thing that lets historical become something that's really easy to get into is the fact that there are so many documentaries out there. How many documentaries out there are there on like fantasy worlds and stuff? Yeah. Pretty much none. If you're looking at historical, you want Vietnam, you go to Discovery Channel, National Geographic for certain stuff. Yeah. You will find easy, digestible content that will let you see into the world very easily.
That's a very good point, actually, because you look at the historical side and you say, well, where do I start? Yeah. Well, maybe start by picking a cool movie.
Yeah, or TV series. Band of Brothers was great for World War II.
Could be a TV series, could be like Vikings, Band of Brothers. Vikings, honestly, is what has led me into the Dark Ages stuff. Really interested in that. But if you pick a cool TV series or a cool movie, something that you've watched, not from a perspective of I love history, but you've come away from it thinking that movie was really cool. Yeah. I really enjoyed that. You could then take that movie as your first stepping stone, and as Justin says, the wealth of information that's out there in terms of documentaries and things, and then you just start slowly collecting. And it's up to you just how much detail you go into. But the beauty of it is there is a lot of detail that you can optionally go into. And it's that optional thing I want to stress. You don't have to be an expert from the start. The joy of this historical gaming, for me at least, has been finding it out as I go along. It's been brilliant.
For myself, the one that I'm sort of skirting around at the minute is American War of Independence, American Civil War. I've been watching a lot of documentaries on that recently. There you go. Yeah. And they've really just been making me want to play out those battles on the tabletop, because I think it would just be so much fun and so cool to play.
Well, this is your man for that. He's one of the world's leading experts in those periods, and especially on the gaming side. Yeah.
Help me, Obi, you're my only hope.
We've got to hook these guys up. It's well worth, if you fancy joining me and in my journey. No, it took me a long time and a lot of effort to get into the Grognard Society, but I'm telling you, it's well worth it.
What you guys touched on a second ago are two really good points. Just me personally, I always call it what I call the Braveheart Effect. Yeah. And back in the early 90s, believe it or not, I had never heard of William Wallace or any of the wars of the Scottish Succession or anything like that. And then, of course, I sat down in a movie theater and I watched the Mel Gibson movie, and I was, of course, blown away. And I was like, oh, my God, this is awesome. I go out and I start reading about this guy and reading about what's going on in the late 13th, early 14th centuries, realized how absolutely crap that movie is as far as it's a cartoon, but it got me reading. So like you were saying before, don't be afraid that you watch movies, watch television or whatever, as long as that's your first step, as long as you take that second step. Because that's where you're actually going to find out what really happened. But it's something that you never would have probably started if it hadn't been for the movie. So the movie, kind of gets you started, makes you aware of certain things that interest you, and then you go, offline and you start, working on your research. And as far as finding a starting point and being afraid of never being an expert, I can't remember who said it, but there's a famous saying: an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less. So finally, he knows everything about nothing. Yeah. Don't worry about being an expert. I've been neck deep in World War II for 30 years, and I still haven't found the walls. Yeah. There's no bottom to it. There's no top to it. You'll never run out of new things to learn. The thing about historical wargaming, people can talk about their different genres or whatever, which one they like the best, and that's a great discussion to have. The one thing that historical will always win, you never run out of fluff. If you want to call it fluff. You never run out of background material.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
Yeah, and some of the stories
stuff.
from history are stranger than anything a fantasy or sci-fi writer will ever come up with.
Well, on the topic of movies, okay, Vietnam in particular has often been oversimplified in the movies, Jim.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are some good ones. The good ones, I usually tend to, warn people off like the really popular movies, but the popular ones like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket are actually pretty good as far as their historical touch points. Like, connect the dots as far as, what was going on. You can kind of see, some movies are more blatant or obvious about it than others. Others are more, that's when this is, or that's what these guys are with, or whatever. Yeah. And down to like the shoulder flashes on the guy's uniform, like 25th Infantry in Platoon. That's the famous Tropic Lightning Division, 25th Infantry that you see in the Flames of War, Vietnam.
Yeah.
Where they were in November of '67, and it puts that little title card. Actually, it starts in September of '67. It goes through. Chris Taylor, that's Charlie Sheen's character, is writing a letter to his grandma, like halfway through the movie. He's like, "Happy New Year's, 1968." Yeah. Like, they're getting ready to get near the Tet Offensive. And then at the end of the movie, there's this huge NVA attack, 144th NVA Regiment. And then if you actually dig deep enough into some of the records, you're like, holy crap, there's, X Brigade of 25th Infantry Division near the Cambodian border, just like they say in the movie. Mm-hmm. And, 144th NVA is in the area, and, there's other units around, and it's actually pretty solid. Yeah. Full Metal Jacket's even more accurate as far as, the units and like what was going on in what town, what city, what day, what district. So yeah, there are definitely some good ones out there.
Well, if I was going to put you on the spot, Jim, to give people a little primer of the background to the Vietnam War, just in terms of just a couple of minutes of the setup of the war, of what to kind of set the scene before we talk specifically about some of the aspects of gaming of it. How would you tackle that?
Okay, so the Vietnam War is technically, or some people call it the Second Indochina War. It's going on, depending on who you ask, for hundreds of years. But you can trace its immediate causes to World War II. Yeah. Ironically, to the fall of France. Mm-hmm. So Indochina, it's called French Indochina in those days. It's not only Vietnam, it's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It's all one colony of French Indochina. Mm-hmm. 1940 comes around. France gets overrun by the Germans. France has to cut a deal with the Germans. That's where you get Vichy France and Free France from. And that persists through most of the rest of World War II. And what happens with a lot of French colonies is some French colonies go free French and line themselves up with the Americans, and some... It kind of depends on the generals and the officers and the governors that France had in those colonies at the time. Some of them that I think that were a little bit closer to the Vichy government wound up as Axis colonies. Yeah. And you see a lot of Axis colonies actually having to be attacked and invaded by other French troops, Syria, Madagascar, etc. Vietnam, or what's going to become Vietnam, French Indochina, starts off as a Vichy French colony. It's in the Axis's pocket. Yeah. Late in March of '41, I think it is, Hitler is putting together tripartite pact of the different, his allies. He's trying to get Japan to join him as an official ally. He's like, here's a sweetener for the deal. I'll give you this colony that's right next to Singapore. Mm-hmm. That's Great Britain's big colony in the Pacific. With Vietnam, or what's going to become Vietnam, you're going to be that much closer to invading Singapore and knocking the British out of the Pacific. Yeah. That's exactly what happens. So you have the Japanese invading, and they don't even have to invade it. You have the Japanese occupying French Indochina. Mm-hmm. To resist this, a guy named Ho Chi Minh gets started. He's supported by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. This is the granddaddy of the CIA. Yeah. This is the Americans, ironically, kind of helping Ho Chi Minh get on his feet and getting started with the Viet Minh. Mm-hmm. So, ironically, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh starts off as one of our allies. He's fighting against the Japanese. World War II ends. The Japanese leave. The French want French Indochina back. The Americans are not keen on this. The Americans, people start talking about that old school European colonialism, and Americans, the hair on the back of our neck starts to stand up. It's not something that we're, given our history, it's not something that we're a big fan of. President Truman kind of acquiesces and kind of supports the move. He kind of, holds his nose and says, okay, you can have it back. Yeah. Because he's trying to get French support for the founding of the United Nations and NATO. NATO was just trying to get started. And France was kind of on the fence. It was a big communist movement in France at the time. So we were worried about the French politically. So the French get back into French Indochina immediately. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh feel betrayed, and there's an instant war. So that's the first Indochina War that gets started with French versus our former allies, the Viet Minh, in 1946. This burns to 1954 when the French lose the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and of course everybody's heard of that battle. French make this last do-or-die effort to kind of take control of North Vietnam, where most of the communist activity is at the time. They get surrounded in this epic siege. There's like 50,000 Viet Minh troops there, with 50,000 support troops, 100,000 total. Pinned down, there's like 13 or 14,000 French paratroopers, allies, Laotians. They're not getting out there. They asked the Americans for help. By now, Eisenhower's president. Eisenhower and the French never really got along very well. Yeah. The French go so far as to start requesting nuclear weapons to break their people out of there. Oh my. The Americans aren't having any of it. The United Nations isn't having any of it. The French get kicked out of Vietnam. So the Viet Minh have won, and they say, look, we're taking the whole country. We're going communist. The peace talks come. They get badly disappointed. Sorry, we're only going to have a North Vietnam that's communist and a South Vietnam that's to be determined. We're going to have elections in a couple of years. We're going to set up this temporary government. That temporary government never really joins the North. The North loses patience. There's this guerrilla war that kind of gets started in the South. At first, the North doesn't support it. Later on, they start. This is where you get those two sides of the communist effort in North Vietnam. You have the actual North Vietnamese government that's in Hanoi. Yeah. And in the South, you get the National Liberation Front, which a South Vietnamese journalist eventually dubs the Viet Cong, and the name sticks. The French by now, of course, are long gone. The Americans slowly get dragged into it. You get the Tonkin Gulf incident in '64. Okay, now the Americans are in. JFK wanted to get out, depending on who you ask. Yeah. Wanted to get out of Vietnam. He kind of saw the writing on the wall. He gets assassinated in '63. '64, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the LBJ, is now in office. Tonkin Gulf is in '64. The Americans are getting more and more dragged into it. We know now that Tonkin Gulf never really happened. Whether or not it was an actual conspiracy or an accident or a miscommunication, that's up to your interpretation and whether or not you've been fitted for your tinfoil hat. It definitely didn't happen, though. That's not for dispute. Those American destroyers, the USS Maddox, was never attacked by those North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Yeah. So now the Americans are in. You start getting these big pitched battles. '65, you see Ai Drang. That's famously depicted in We Were Soldiers. That's in November of '65. Operation Starlight, that's the first big Marine battle in '65. Okay, now the Americans are in. Let's get it over with. Yeah. Then in LBJ's Vietnam policy, if you had to wrap it up in a nutshell, in the mid-'60s is, oh, for God's sake, we so don't need to be there. Just get it over with. Yeah. You get this big buildup in '66. The Americans really go on the offensive in '67. And it wasn't really obvious at the time, and some people might disagree because they're looking at old information or old records, but the records are in now. Enough stuff has been declassified. '67, the North Vietnamese were really starting to come under pressure. The bombing was actually working. Yeah. They weren't sure how long their civilian population was going to put up with this. Their battlefield losses were astronomical. They realized they weren't fighting the French. These are Americans. They have way too much money, way too much firepower. And in mid-'67, some of the communist leaders in the South say, you know what, before we give up, or before we really go back to the negotiating table, let's make one last push to really up our ante and really give us some extra bargaining chips at the table.
Yeah.
And this is where you get the Tet Offensive from.
So the Tet Offensive was a push by the Vietnamese then to try and establish themselves a better foothold to go into potential negotiations then at that point, or
the object, again, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
And one of the points we really wanted to make with this article series is that the enemy, the communist Vietnamese, were not a united front.
Yeah.
So it kind of comes out of General Tan is the guy's name in the South. In the Central Office for South Vietnam is like the communist infrastructure or political office in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive originally is his idea, and he's a lot more aggressive with it. He's like, we can attack everywhere at once. We'll hit all 44 provincial capitals. We'll hit every American base. We'll really hit the South Vietnamese army and the South Vietnamese cities and population centers. And what we'll do is we'll cause a mass panic. We'll cause enough confidence in this corrupt and just hated. And there's a whole bunch of social, political, even religious reasons I can go into. South Vietnamese government in Saigon is hated. And of course, the Americans are supporting them for reasons that surpass understanding to this day. But we can cause this government to collapse.
Yeah.
There'll be a popular uprising on our side. Everyone will join us, the communists now, and we'll bring down that Saigon government. We'll put in a new government in its place. And of course, the second that new communist government is in place in South Vietnam, we'll demand two things: unification with the North, and the Americans, get your tanks off our lawn.
Yeah.
That was the plan. This plan gets to the North. The North takes one look at it. This is General Vo Nguyen Giap, I should say. He's the guy who won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. He's like, you guys are crazy. There's no way you're going head-to-head with the Americans and walking away whole. But by now, Ho Chi Minh's heard of it. Lee Tuan, that's the party chief or the general secretary of the Communist Party in North Vietnam. He's actually the real power in North Vietnam. It's not really Ho Chi Minh at this point.
Yeah.
By now, Ho Chi Minh is really old. I can't remember how old he really was, but he was knocking on heaven's door at this point.
Yeah.
He's, everyone kind of bows when he walks in the room, but the real power is this other guy, Lee Tuan. He's for it. The original general in the South dies of a heart attack in mid-67. Now Giap, who has never supported this plan, kind of inherits it. He's like, now your job is to make it work. He looks at it. He puts his own spin on it. And so the reason for all this detail is the Tet Offensive kind of has like this confused beginning as far as what it actually intends to do. And that's important because then, of course, the Tet Offensive happens. It gets this very mixed result. And the debate begins on whether or not the Tet Offensive was a success or not.
Yeah.
And how do you determine if something is a success? Well, what was it trying to do, and what did it do? And you compare those two. It's up for debate what it was even trying to do.
Yeah.
So as far as debate on whether or not it was a success or not, that's really up for discussion.
Now, the Tet Offensive is considered by many, I imagine yourself as well, Jim, as almost like a great place to start in the gaming side of Vietnam, because the battles are a bit more conventional. I've heard you refer to it almost as un-Vietnam, in that it breaks that preconception of the Americans heading out to find Viet Cong and the ambushes and booby traps and stuff. And also it's spread over quite a lot of different theaters of operation. So it's not just jungles. There's cities and stuff like that in it as well.
Oh yeah, Justin and I were talking about this before we were recording. There's that stereotypical preconception of what a Vietnam battle and following what a Vietnam war game should look like. And you picture Hueys, you picture rice paddies, jungles, Rolling Stones music or whatever. Here we go. Some sort of hidden movement system where you can't see the Viet Cong or the NVA. And then the Americans run into something, and chaos ensues. Mm-hmm. The Tet Offensive junks all that.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive is especially the NLF, National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, but also the NVA or PAVN, depending on your preference, coming out of hiding and attacking the South Vietnamese and the Americans in the open.
Yeah.
And that's where you get a lot of these additional gaming tables that you can set up. That you were talking about a second ago. It's not just jungles and rice paddies. Mm-hmm. There are fire bases. There are towns, there are cities. There's a lot of urban combat, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And we definitely hit this in the article series. There's a lot of big city battles in the Tet Offensive.
Now you cover multiple. Sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying. After that, there's the Tet Offensive that comes out and hits the Americans and the South Vietnamese, and within like the first couple of days, the Americans start that push back, and that's where you kind of if you now that you've had your more conventional battle that you might if you're a World War II player or a Great War player, ACW player or whatever. Now that you've had that, when the Americans and their allies start that push back into the jungles, and that's when the battles become a little bit more on that standard Vietnam model.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can go forward from there.
Jim, what game systems? Now, you covered multiple game systems in the article series, so you're looking at gaming Vietnam in a number of different ways. And what were the key game systems that have been covered so far?
Well, the ones that I use personally are Force on Force. That's by, let me get this straight because I always mess it up. Ambush Alley Games.
Yeah.
I'll explain why this is confusing in a second. Ambush Alley Games that came out that worked with Osprey a few years ago. I don't think that partnership is still in production.
Mm-hmm.
They came out with a game called Force on Force.
Yeah.
And the reason that's kind of confusing is the very first supplement they came out with was for Vietnam called Ambush Valley.
Yes.
And there's also an Ambush Valley book written about a U.S. Marine Corps infantry battalion in the I Corps sector in the northern part of South Vietnam.
Uh-huh.
So you've got a real book, you've got a supplement, you've got a game that are all kind of have either the exact same title or a very similar title.
Yeah.
So that's one of the games I use. I also use Valor and Victory for my larger battles.
Mm-hmm.
Valor and Victory was originally produced by Barry Doyle. It's free. It's always been, it started off as free print and play. You can get it on Board Game Geek.
Yeah.
And it was just a guy who really loved, back when there were, much more in-depth war games than really we see nowadays. There was just a guy who really loved Advanced Squad Leader.
Yeah.
And you guys know who that, you old grognards. There you go. That's how you get to that gold level.
Yeah, okay. I still have some journey to make here.
Well, I mean, you guys know me. I'm like, Jim Hex Encounter Oriskany Johnson or whatever. Yeah. And that game got too much for me. You sit me down at a game of Advanced Squad Leader, and I'm like, oh my God, my brain is leaking out of my ears. This guy took that and he said, look, this game's out of print because it's got way too complicated. I'm just going to strip it down and we're going to play it the way it was supposed to be played. That's where Valor and Victory comes from. Open source, free to print and play, written for World War II. It's World War II squad combat. Then myself and my gaming partner here in Fort Lauderdale, Aras, or Aras on the site,
mm-hmm.
Alex, kind of tore it apart, put Vietnam weapons into it, put it back together, saw where the math would take us, came up with our own counters, and we started doing some Vietnam play testing with that.
Yeah. And
it worked beautifully. Now, I mean, I design and modify and tweak a lot of games. A lot of times they don't work. This one was a success, I'm happy to say. So those are the two games that I use in the series. Mm-hmm. I knew that that's not like, most of the games that a lot of other people play, so we definitely wanted to cover other games that probably more people play. And that's, of course, Flames of War does a huge Vietnam supplement. Mm-hmm. They start off with Tour of Duty, so that's where Dave PBG comes in. We also got Bothi has a huge force. Andre 77, he was at the boot camp. He's got a huge North Vietnamese force, all the way up to MiGs and T-54, C-55s. He's got a huge one. James 123T, I'm hoping I remember that correctly, has a huge force. They play also Chain of Command, I think, has a Vietnam game system out there. Yeah. So there's a lot out there. Charlie Don't Surf by Two Fat Lardies. Mm-hmm. Even if we don't, because when I'm setting up my tables, I have to play the games that I have and I'm familiar with or whatever. But in the comments and also in our support thread that's now up, we're definitely trying to bring some light, and we encourage people who play these other game systems, Charlie Don't Surf, Flames of War, the new NOM that's coming out for Flames of War. Yeah. Big coincidence there. Why did that come out in February of 2018? Could it be,
it's because they didn't want to wait 875 years, Jim.
Yeah, so we're really encouraging these players that maybe have tables and miniatures and setups and familiarity with the rules for these other systems to, really start posting in this other, because you can't post photos in the article threads, but over in the support threads, you can post your own tables, your own comments, your own documents, YouTube links for your favorite Vietnam soundtrack. Every war has its ups and downs, but Vietnam probably has the best soundtrack. I don't think that's up for too much dispute.
Yeah, I think that's pretty indisputable.
I think I'm expecting you to argue that one just for Waterloo.
Oh well, the bands were playing at Waterloo was cool, but Vietnam trumps them all in terms of its soundtrack.
I have actually playlists for when I'm out, jogging or whatever. That's like that old school,
Yeah,
it's more of the American stuff, but that old school, like marching, drum and fife music. But so I definitely do appreciate it, but you can't put that up against Jim Morrison and the Doors.
No, you can't really. You really can't. All right, so Jim, if we're going to talk about a few of the highlights and the takeaways of the article series, so regardless of if you already game Vietnam, we'd love you in the comments talking about your experience of the different games that you game.
Yeah.
If you have never gamed Vietnam and you've quite fancy it, get stuck in there, because there's just loads of takeaways from it. And if you've never actually got into the historical gaming, but you're thinking to yourself, this Vietnam stuff sounds interesting, then again, get stuck into the comments, because there's a load of people in there that will do their very best to help and support you and get you on those initial steps and talk you through the different game options. But Jim, if we had to distill it down to a few highlights and takeaways of the article series that people should come and check it out for, what would they be, mate?
Okay, so from the historical side, one of the things we really tried to bring home was that it's not a two-faction war.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the U.S. versus the Vietnamese. The National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong, was a very different beast from the North Vietnamese Army, or People's Army of Vietnam, and they did not always see eye to eye. Again, depending on the size of your tinfoil hat. There are historians who will still maintain that the North Vietnamese army allowed Tet to happen. They allowed the NLF to kind of take the lead on it, knowing it was going to fail, knowing they were going to take tremendous casualties and infrastructure damage, to the point where they were pretty much destroyed as a cohesive military and political force. This allows the NVA to take complete control of the war effort from the communist side. Communists were not always seeing eye to eye. There was a big problem between the two, a lot of mistrust, a lot of cultural problems, because the NLF, the Viet Cong, were almost all South Vietnamese. And this is kind of a big deal. Why we were in Vietnam supposedly to defend the South Vietnamese against the communists. Most of the South Vietnamese we were fighting were the communists.
Yeah.
And it goes into the absurdity of what we were doing there. We were literally fighting the wrong people. So from the historical standpoint, we also wanted to highlight some of the allies that the United States had in there. It wasn't just the Americans, obviously. South Vietnamese Army was our biggest ally. We do try to make sure that they get mentioned. We do use some of their units in some of our games. Terrible as they were, there were some good units in there as well. That's the Army of Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. We also try to use, we do mention the South Koreans were in there, the Australians and the New Zealanders, the Anzacs, had a task force in there. And we put a whole game of them in there for the Anzacs. And then there were, Taiwan was in there, the Philippines were in there, all these, American allies in the Pacific.
Yeah.
This was really a UN sanctioned war like Korea was. These are American allies in the Pacific that are very concerned about the spread of communism in the 60s in the Asia Pacific region. More on the gaming side, like what kind of games you can play. One of the salient points we really wanted to drive home was try a game. If you don't try Force on Force, try a game like Force on Force, because what these games do is they're specifically built not for World War II, like Flames of War is, and then here's a Vietnam supplement. It's World War II with helicopters and jungles. Okay. That ironically might work for some of the Tet Offensive battles because of the scope and direction of the Tet Offensive battles. But if you really want that, under the helmet, watch out, who's on point, watch out for the booby traps kind of Vietnam feel. Games like Force on Force, and again, I'm not familiar with Charlie Don't Surf, so that might also be a great game. I'm not disputing that at all, because these games really drive home the asymmetry of some of these battles and the difference between what they call kinetic and non-kinetic warfare. It's true asymmetry, as in like the first big part of the book. Oh, here's force on force. Great. Here's how you move your forces. Here's how a unit shoots, take morale, take casualties. Okay, cool. I got through the book, and wait a minute, there's this whole other section. Oh, here's how an irregular army works. So when you're playing a regular versus an irregular army in force on force, the two players are literally playing two different sets of rules.
Wow.
The system's different. The firing systems, how they take casualties are different. What they're allowed to do is different. How their units can combine or shrink or fall apart or whatever. And you're literally playing two different game systems. And the winner, just like in real warfare, is the guy who gets his opponent to play his game.
That's Sun Tzu.
That's right. There you go. So that's a big thing that I would, highlight in games, either force on force or, also in the same wheelhouse as force on force.
Yeah.
Casualty management is a big deal in Vietnam. When a unit gets killed or gets eliminated, when you sustain a casualty in a game like Force on Force, or like we built into our Vietnam edition of Valor and Victory, you don't just reach out and take the figure off the table.
Yeah.
That guy is now knocked down. In Force on Force, you can, if there's another friendly unit there with him, he can make a first aid check. That first aid check tells you, is he dead? Is he slightly wounded? Is he lightly wounded, seriously wounded, or did he just shake it off? I mean, you can take a casualty, knock a figure over in Force on Force. You get a medic over to him. Doesn't even have to be a medic. You get a friendly soldier over to him, and it turns out he was only flash blinded, or he got the wind knocked out of him.
Yeah.
The bullet bounced off his helmet or whatever. He kind of shakes it off, or he's dead, or something in between. And there's like 4 possible results. Those 4 possible results have different effects on gameplay. And then if he is knocked down, what are you going to do about it? You have to pull the guy off the board somehow. You have medics as actual units on the table. Not too many war games do this. You have a machine gun section, rifle platoon, mortars. Oh, here are my medics. And oh, by the way, those medics have a defense value, which means the NVA can shoot at them. So you have to protect your medics. We've had some great gaming moments with medics in our games. So this also means that because you've only got so many medics, that the Americans are going to really have to stay grouped up in these big, secure clumps.
Yeah.
There's no rule that enforces that, but before you know it, if the game is sufficiently designed, before you know it, you find yourself doing the same thing that the Americans are doing in the real theater. They don't want to go in the jungle. Every time they move into certain kind of hexes or certain kinds of areas, they have to make a booby trap check.
Yeah.
If a bunch of them move all at the same time, they have to make 1 booby trap check. If they move in 10 different directions, they have to make 10 booby trap checks.
Yeah.
So before you know it, the game is kind of beating you into that Vietnam mindset of stay together, stay in the open, stay on the roads, stay in the villages, and we'll just bombard that area with artillery. We'll send a helicopter gunship strike over there, and before you know it, you're faced with the same, vicariously, obviously, the same kind of decisions that the Americans are faced with over there in country, so to speak, and you find yourself kind of doing the same things, making the same mistakes, falling into the same pitfalls. Oh, look, I killed an NVA guy over there and a VC guy over there, and before you know it, you're counting bodies. And how did I still lose? Because the Americans did the body count in Vietnam, and guess what? Vietnam's a communist country nowadays, so take a guess how that turned out. Civilians and prisoners of war. We have had some terrible great moments on our tables with civilians and prisoners of war. I had one of those gigantic 50 caliber douche DSHK Russian machine guns in a hooch. I was playing the NVA, and there just happened to be a civilian counter in there. And we've got to run our civilians almost like the zombies in The Walking Dead, where neither player really controls them.
Yes.
You roll to see if they move, and if they move, you kind of roll to see like which direction they go.
Yeah.
And these civilians just would not get out of that hooch. And I was happy to, I wasn't going to kick him out of there. I'm not even allowed to kick him out of there.
Yeah.
But all that time, my opponent, Alex, He's got grenade launchers, machine guns. He's got off-board 81 millimeter mortars sighted in on him. He can't fire on this hooch. And this DHSK is just chewing up his people.
Yeah.
And he can't object because there are civilians in the way. The second those civilians move, the look on his face, when he picked up that fistful of dice, and just went, and,
now I can do it. Yeah.
My gun crew was a grease spot within like 30 seconds. I mean, it's that you have this incredible amount of firepower. I hope you have the luxury of, when and where you can release it.
Yes.
Booby traps, hidden movement, there's just a lot of things that we try to address in the series from a gaming perspective that I think are really interesting as far as, Vietnam on the tabletop.
Fantastic. Look, Jim, it is always a pleasure to have you join us in the studio. The 5th part goes up on Monday. We will call it that. Jim, thank you very much. Right. Back to me and him and Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take it easy, guys.